I'd like to continue what we started with last week, which was a very interesting topic. And, it's a strange thing, but there is a number of events that have occurred in the time of Rabbi Akiva, and a number of very interesting medrashim that are associated with him and his time. And the strange thing is that each of these statements about him and the medrashim about him are seen independently. And nobody seems to really have a sense of what was going on in the time of Rabbi Akiva. And I'd like to discuss several things tonight. And we're going to see something from a completely different perspective. First of all, there's a number of things I would like to talk about tonight. There's a very famous medrash that says that when Moshe Rabbeinu went up on the mountain and he received the Torah, and after that, before he was going to die, the second time when he went to Hanavo, and before he was going to die, the Rebbe showed him all the future generations. And one of the people that the Rebbe showed Moshe was Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, of course, who would live considerably down in time, probably for another 1400 years. And when he saw Rabbi Akiva, he was taken aback, Moshe Rabbeinu. And what he did was he saw Rabbi Akiva teaching to his class how to interpret the tagin in the Torah. Now, if you all know, there are certain letters in the Torah that have little crowns. The Sofer writes, there are certain letters that he has to write little crowns. And there are hidden meanings to those little crowns on the different letters. And what Rabbi Akiva was explaining to his students, what the meaning of those little crowns were on the different letters, in different places. And he had the ability to understand an enormous depth in Torah. And what the Medrash says is that when Moshe Rabbeinu saw this, he became jealous. And he said to the Rebbe, he says, this man is astounding, this Rabbi Akiva, because apparently Moshe Rabbeinu was not able to do this. And when he saw Rabbi Akiva doing this, he was astounded, and he said to the Rebbe, if you have a man like this, why do you give me the Torah? So the Rebbe says, basically that, I have my reasons, and each one has its own specific tachlis. And then Moshe Rabbeinu said, let me see what will happen to this man at the end. And the Rebbe showed him with nevuah, with prophecy, and what he saw was a horrifying thing. He saw them selling, or rather he saw Rabbi Akiva dying at the end with the Romans, his skin being ripped off by the Romans. He was one of the 10 martyrs and so on, and he died a very, very difficult death. And with Moshe Rabbeinu said that, he was astounded when he saw this. But this is the basis of the Medrash. One, the jealousy of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the end of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the end of Rabbi Akiva. And when Moshe Rabbeinu said to Bonisham, Zu Torah, Zu Schora, this is the Torah, and this is the reward, like how can a man like this come to such an end? So the Bonisham, of course, said, Gzein Rafonai, it is my decree. And that always refers to the Hanogat HaYichud, or to the fact that the Bonisham has to bring the redemption to the Jews through great suffering. And we're not going to go into that topic tonight. We've explored that, and my God, that's something you can go into for months. How that's done, at least to some degree. So this is a very famous medrash. But the important thing about this medrash are two things: that Moshe was jealous. You can imagine who it must have been that Moshe was jealous. I mean, my God, that we shouldn't be jealous of Moshe Rabbeinu. You see, that Moshe Rabbeinu was able to go up to the mountain, right, and enter into the Shemayim to see the Torah while he was alive. There was no man since the beginning of time that ever has had such an incredible fortune to enter into the Shemayim, into the heavens itself, right, while one is alive, with his body, you see, in a different way, and do that. And what he saw and what he knew, he was able to communicate with God directly, without any kind of trance. He was able to initiate conversations with the Rebbe Shalom. I mean, this is an astounding thing. Imagine to initiate a conversation with the Rebbe Shalom and ask him something that you would ask. That's an incredible, it's an unbelievable thing, but this is what he had. And yet with all this, he was jealous of Rabbi Akiva. So we'd like to understand what that means. There were several other things also. The whole concept of Rabbi Akiva dying, and the 10 martyrs, the way they died, and the fact that they died, is another very big problem. What was going on there? What it was is the story of the 10 martyrs, which is very basic, is that Hadrian called some of the great Chachamim, and he said to them, from what I know, what I understand is Joseph, one of your ancestors, was sold by his brothers. Isn't that true? So he said, yes, that's true. So he said, well, what is the Jewish law if somebody kidnaps somebody else? So he said, well, the Jewish law is kidnapping, which is what it was, the sale of the Mechiyus Yosef, the sale of Yosef was kidnapping. So he said, what is the Jewish law? So this great, the Talmud Chacham says, the law is death. If you kidnap someone, you die. So Hadrian says, well, who is ever paid, who is ever liable for that? The brothers never died, did they? So then Hadrian says, in that case, I am going to take 10 of the greatest Chachamim in Israel Yisrael, and you will die for their sin. I mean, that's an astounding thing. So I believe the one who was speaking, one of them, anyway, so the one he was supposed to went back, and they discussed it among themselves in Yerushalayim and in Eretz Yisrael, and they didn't know, is this Hadrian's Michigan idea? Is this a crazy idea of Hadrian? Or is this something that the Bonachim is a Gzera from the Shemayim? So one of them, Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, the Kohen Gadol time, Rabbi Shmuel was a very, very great person. He did certain types of Kabbalistic practices. He said the Yizkiyat Hashem, he mentioned the divine name, certain mysterious names, and he arose, he went up into the Shemayim. Now when he went up, it doesn't mean he went up bodily, but his neshama went up in such a way that he was able to know what was going on even though he was here. And when his neshama came up there and said to saw the malachim, he came to one very great malach and he said, is this true? So this malach says, I want you to know that this is true. That this is not Hadrian's idea, but this is a gzera from the Bonishim himself, that 10 of you must die, you see. And that's how it started. That's how it, and the 10 is the greatest. I mean, you read on Yom Kippur, we say it on Tisha B'Av. It's what's called Asora Haruge Malchus. Asora means 10. The 10 who died, Haruge means died, or martyrs, Hamalchus, who died at the hands of the Roman Empire. It's another very strange thing. Now the one who died, the greatest of the ones who died was Rabbi Akiva. And the story of Rabbi Akiva's death is quite well known. When the Romans took him out to kill him, what they did was they flayed him. They started taking off his skin. It was a terrible thing and so on. And before he died, he said that all my life he was always wanted to become the mitzvah of what? That you will love the Bonachim even with your own life. And now he's ecstatic that he has this opportunity to perform this mitzvah at this point in time. And before he died, he said the Shema, and he died at the word Echad. And when he said the word Echad and he died, there was a baskol, and a voice from heaven came out and said, Ashracha, you should be happy, Rabbi Akiva, that you died with the word Echad on your lips. But the truth of the matter is, this whole concept of the death of Rabbi Akiva it's a strange one. You see, it's very strange. And I've seen it, I forget where I've seen it, but each of the 10 great tzaddikim who died, okay, I mean, I would mention the names, but I don't know that the names would have any real significance. Of the 10 great ones who died, each one represented one of the sons of Yaakov. And that's exactly what it was. And the Bonishim told Rabbi Shmuel, the Malach said, that since the time of Yosef, the Bonishim has never found such 10 great men in the generation that he can literally sacrifice those 10 men for the sin of what the brothers did. So, I mean, it's an extraordinary compliment, you see. But each one of the 10 that died was against one of the brothers, you see. One of the brothers. But the fact is, when you look at it, there were only 9 who were involved in the Mechila. There were only 9. And that's because Yosef was being sold. There were 12 brothers. Yosef was being sold, right? Binyamin was in the house, and Reuben wasn't there. So there are only 9. So then why were 10 sacrificed? Interesting question. What? Please. So the question is, the 9 brothers, why were there only 9 brothers who sold Yosef, yet 10 of the Tanoim, or the great Tzaddikim, died? And what the interesting thing was that the 9 brothers, when they sentenced Yosef, what they did was they did grab Yosef and they sold him or throw him into the pit. What they did was they formulated a bezdin, and they paskined that he was chayav misa. That's what it was. And the truth of the matter is their psak din was somewhat personal because they were jealous of him. That's why they were punished. But the fact is they paskined that he was a roidef, that he was a moiser because he went ahead to the father, different things that he had done. He slandered them, whatever the story is, but he was chayav misa. But in order to fulfill the thing, what they did was they needed a 10th member, and they said that the Rebbeinu Shalom will be the 10th part of us. So they brought the Rebbeinu Shalom into the group that paskin the Misa of Yosef. And because they brought the Rebbeinu Shalom in, he never appeared against Yaakov until Yosef again was seen by Yaakov. Yaakov never again didn't have Nevuah or Ruach Kodesh for all the years that Yosef was sold. Because it says there, Vayechi Yaakov, and Yaakov lived or Vatachi, it says there in the Pasuk, Vatachi Esu of Yaakov, and the spirit of Yaakov was revived. And what the Gemara learns out is that from then on, again, he became a Navi. But for 17 years, he was blank. For a long, long time. Actually, more than 17 years. He was more, because for a long time he was like blank. He wasn't in touch. And one of the reasons why he wasn't in touch with the Bonisham, because of the fact that the Bonisham was now included as part of the group, which means that you needed also somebody to atone for the participation of the Bonisham. And that was Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva was the most outstanding. And when the Baskol says, happy are you that you died in the word Echad, it's because Rabbi Akiva represented the Bonisham in that compensation. You see. Okay, I'm just throwing that in quickly. It's much deeper than this. But we understand? So, but that's a basic problem. What we want to understand is, what is this? What are these 10 ones that died for the name? Like, what is happening over here? And what was the significance of this period that this had to happen? Okay, let's go on. We all know the story of Lag BaOmer. But what's the story of Lag BaOmer? We know that Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students. And what happened, in a short space between Pesach, right? And what do you call it? In Shavuot, suddenly 24,000 students died. That's an enormous, they all died of, I think cholera, it was. And the Gemara says the reason why they died, because they did not relate to each other in an honorable way. They probably spoke Lashon Hara, all kinds of sinners, different things. They did not give cover one to the other. They didn't treat each other respectfully. So suddenly they all died in the span of 2 months. 24,000 somebody, and this was no 24,000, this was a cream of Klal Yisrael. And just to show you that, well, look at the other students who survived. And who were these other students? Reb Meir. Reb Meir was one of the students of Rabbi Akiva. Okay? Reb Meir. Reb Shimon. Okay? Reb Yossi. Reb Nechemiah. There were a number of them. Just to show you how big of them, Reb Meir. Reb Meir was a student of Rabbi Akiva. And he basically had a student who you all probably know, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi Yehuda Prince, who wrote the whole Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was a student of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi once said that the reason why I attained such a great stature, because I was zeicha to learn this, I saw the back of Rabbi Meir. And because of that, I was zeicha to have such an incredible insight. That's how astounding Rabbi Meir was. Rabbi Shimon, the author of the Zohar, you see, and the one who was the greatest Kabbalist, one of the greatest Kabbalists of his time, you see, and that's an outstanding person. Rabbi Yossi, all of them. There were only 5 students left over, or the 5 of the greatest students that were left over, and each of the 5 students, and mark this well, were the foundation of the entire oral law that we have now. Very important to understand this. When we look at the entire Torah, what do we have? We have the Chumash, right? We have the Mishnah, right? And we have certain Sfom, but the main Sfom that we have from the time of the Tanoim was the Mishnayos, you see, the Mishnayos, and we have the Zohar from Rav Shimon ben Yochai, and we have, what do you call it, these are the basic things, but the entire Mishnah comes from Rav Meir, it's based on Rav Meir, and the whole Zohar is based on Rav Shimon. That means that a great deal of what we learn today comes from several students of Rabbi Akiva. Could you imagine what we would have had today if the other 24,000 had lived? Most of the Torah which exists today comes from 5 of his students. Because from him came almost the entire Torah Shabbat Peh. Could you imagine what it would have been like with 24,000 others? That goes to show you what the depth of these 24,000. That's why we have Lag BaOmer. That's why there's this sphere. We have the time, the Avelis between Pesach and Shavuot. Why? Not because just 24,000 people died. Many times in Jewish history, 24,000 people have died. But the reason why we do that is because those 24,000, because the loss of 24,000 students from Rabbi Akiva was a loss of enormous Torah that we never again will have. That's what it was. You see. So, this is another very, very important thing. And it shows you who Rabbi Akiva was. That all of these people came from him. Can you imagine his intellect? And so on. So he was a very outstanding person, Rabbi Akiva, but we also want to have some kind of understanding, you see. Some kind of understanding of what happened to these 24,000 students. You see, what happened there? We're trying to establish a connection between several different historical incidents. The fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was jealous of Rabbi Akiva, the fact that there were 10 martyrs that died at that point in time, the fact that there 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva died. Are these separate historical incidents? Or in some way can we see some kind of underlying connection? Now there's one more very famous medrash that relates to Rabbi Akiva, which is very important, that should be known, is the following. There were 4 Tanoim, 4 very great. A Tana was an individual who lived in the time of Rabbi Akiva, who lived after the prophets, after the Nevi'im, the sages of Israel called Tanoim, okay? And those are the ones who authored the Mishnah and the various different works, but they were called Tanoim, Rabbi Akiva being a prime example, okay? Now there were 4 Tanoim, 4 men along with Rabbi Akiva, who did something very strange. There was Rabbi Akiva himself, okay? Then there was another one called Elisha ben Abuya, okay, or called Acher. Acher means outside or the other, and I'll explain to that in a minute why it's called Acher. There's another one called Ben Azai, who was really, Ben Azai was the son-in-law of Rabbi Akiva. He married Rabbi Akiva's daughter, and then he divorced her. He divorced her because he was so much in love with the Torah that he couldn't bear the responsibility of being a husband, because he was such an incredible masmid, very unusual person, Ben Azai. Shimon Ben Azai, but he's referred to as Ben Azai, and another person called Ben Zoma, or Shimon Ben Zoma, also. 4 of these men, Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, and Rabbi Shimon ben Zoma. Now the Gemara relates a very bizarre story about these 4. And the truth of the matter is, the story is such that it's very difficult to understand. But I'm going to throw it into the situation here and see if we can't develop some kind of understanding of what happened here. It says, Dalad Nichnes Lepardis. There were 4 great men who entered into the garden. One of them, and only one, came out whole. The other 3 met a very terrible fate. What is the fate? Rabbi Akiva entered into the garden and he came out fine and healthy. Nichnas b'sholom, he entered in peace. V'yotza b'sholom, and he came out in peace. Elisha ben Abuya became an apikoros. He became a min. A min is an apikoros, someone who no longer believes in the divinity of B'nai Shalom. Imagine that. Now you say, well, okay, there are a lot of apikosim around, but wait. Who is Elisha ben Abuya? Elisha ben Abuya was the other Rebbe of Rav Meir. You see, the other Rebbe of Rav Meir. And he was so big, Elisha ben Abuya, even though he was an apikoros, that what happened was, Rav Meir was, after he became an apikoros, you see, Rav Meir was the only one that would still learn from him. Rav Meir would learn from Elisha ben Abuya, even after he was already an apikoros, he was a min. And you're not supposed to learn from a min. No other chacham would go to him. So they asked him, how is it possible for you to learn with a person who's apikoros? So he said, because I have the ability to take out the kernel from the chaff, I can do that. Most people cannot do that, but I can do it. But the question is, fine, you can do it. So you're not influenced by his irreligiosity. He wasn't a Shevet Shabbos, nothing. So he said, if that's the truth, but why do you want to learn from him? So he said, because you have no idea what this man knows. And Rav Meir was 1,000% correct. You see. In fact, they once both had a conversation. It's reported that they were both on mules, and it was on mules. In other words, they were walking on the Shabbos. They were both walking on the Shabbos, and they were talking in Torah. And they were both very intensely involved, and suddenly Elisha ben Abuya, who is not religious anymore, turns to Rav Meir and says, you cannot go any further, because we just reached the outer boundary, the Tchum. Which means that while he was talking and learning, he was counting it, and Rav Meir wasn't even aware of this. You see. And he said, you stay here, and he went further, because he wasn't Shevet Shabbos anymore. But he was an astounding individual, and he was a total apikoros. What brought him to become an apikoros? A very strange story brought him. One day what happened is he was walking by and he saw somebody going up a tree to take out the little birds of a nest. Now one of the mitzvahs of the Torah is that if you take out, it's called Shiluch HaKain. If you go up and you want the birds of a nest, I don't know why you want the birds of a nest, but you do, you have to send the mother away so that she's no cause for distress, and then you're allowed to take the little birds. You see. So what happened was, and it says in the Torah that if you abide by this, one of these mitzvahs, you will live a long life. That's one of the few mitzvahs that it says you will live a long life. So there's once an individual that climbed the tree to take some of these little birds, and he sent them other way, and he took the little birds, and he was climbing down, fell off the tree, and died. So Elisha ben Abuya says, how is this possible? How is this possible? So he said, if such a thing is possible, then I don't believe in the entire Torah anymore. That's what he said. So he became an apikoros. Okay, but that's obviously an oversimplification about. That's the immediate story what happened. happened, but it's much deeper than that. And we want to go into this. But anyway, it says 4 men entered into the garden. One Rabbi Akiva who came out fine. Elisha ben Nevuah, when he came out of it, through different stories, Maisim, after that he became an Apikoros. Ben Azai died. Right after that he died. Coming out, he just dropped dead. And Ben Zoma went insane. He became a shaita, totally psychotic. Now that's a bizarre thing. Now what exactly happened over here? What does it mean these 4 men went into a garden? It doesn't mean they didn't go into the Tuileries garden in Paris or something like that. The garden really refers to something else. The garden here means the word pardes. What garden means, the word garden in Hebrew, it's an Aramaic, it's a Greek word. It means pardes, it means a garden. What the word garden really means for, it's a Rosh Tevis or an acronym. The Pei means pshat, or the simple meaning of the Torah. It's the literal meaning of the Torah. Resh stands for remez, or the hints, the different hints that the Torah points to. It's a level of knowledge which is deeper than the literal meaning. Drush is a deeper level than that, and finally Sod is the deepest mystery of the Torah. So when the Medrash says that these 4 went into the garden, it means that these 4 attempted to go to the bottom of the depths of Torah. That's what it means. They did something that no one did before. They went into the garden, and the garden was an unknowable garden, and they went into the deepest level of Torah knowledge. And what happened was they all went in, and only one of them came out alive and well, and that was Rabbi Akiva. The other 3 suffered terrible consequences. Elisha ben Nevuah, who is called Acher. Acher means the other, because he turned aside. He became a non-believer. Elisha ben Nevuah, or Acher, became a non-believer as a result. Shimon ben Azai died, and Shimon ben Zoma went insane. That's the medrash. Strange medrash, isn't it? Bizarre medrash. And there's a simple reason why it's bizarre. Because if you raise your hand and you ask me a question, and I say to you, I don't want to give you the answer, you don't go insane. You don't necessarily become a min. In Chas v'Shalom, nobody surely dies. So in other words, if these 4 attempted to what? To acquire or possess incredibly deep wisdom, the best that they can say is that they failed. So you fail means you don't know. Why should terrible consequences come to them as a result? That's what doesn't make sense. Somehow, because they failed to understand the deepest levels of the Torah, they paid a terrible price. And that doesn't make any sense. The best thing that should have happened to them is simply they should have come out ignorant. They failed in an attempt to understand. If you fail in your attempt to understand something, you remain ignorant. But nothing terrible should happen to you. Yet, 3 of them suffered very terrible consequences. We would like to understand that also. But we would also like to understand what this has to do with Rabbi Akiva, and why Rabbi Akiva walked in and walked out. So we see a number of different incidents that happened to Rabbi Akiva. All of them are always looked at as separate incidents. You know, Rabbi Akiva seems to have he had a long life. He lived 120 years, as long as Moshe Rabbeinu, you see. He had a very long life, and basically, he was involved in several different things. What is the connection? That's what we'd like to explore. Let me just repeat that. The question is, how could the brothers take in the Rebbeinu Shalom into a process which seemed to be a bad, seemed to be a very poor judgment? But as I said, what happens is, anytime when a number of people get together and they want to paskin a certain din, it means they want to do something according to the halachas of the Torah itself. They're entitled to do that. And anytime a certain number of people sit down in order to determine the truth or falsity of a certain transgression, and what the halach is in that particular case, the Shekhinah comes down and in some way, you see, is associated with that effort. That's essentially what the process is about. Now, if the dayanim or the judges or the people who are involved in that process abuse the effort, because in some way they allow personal considerations to determine what the result will be, then that is a distortion of the judiciary process. That's true. So these judges will be punished, and they will be punished severely. That's true. But that doesn't negate the legitimacy of the process itself. You see what I'm saying? So that's why they're able to do it. But the fact that they did abuse it, what they did was they were in a certain sense they were mavazo. They brought a certain amount of dishonor to the name of God by doing this. And that had to be atoned for. You see, somebody had to atone for the shame, the dishonor that was brought on the name of God. You see, and that's what Rabbi Akiva was the one that atoned for that. Now, the question is, why would? Question that's being asked, which is a very good question, is if the 10 brothers of Joseph had to be punished, fine. But why is it that these 10 tzaddikim, Tanoim, who lived 13, 14, 1500 years later, what sense does that make? What do they have to do with the brothers of Joseph? Well, the fact of the matter is that in some way these 10 men were connected to the neshamas of the brothers of Joseph. So in some way there are aspects of these 10 men that were also involved in what had happened before, because it's the entire process where different Jews are connected to other Jews and we are connected to people of the past. And because of that, there was some aspect of these 10 tzaddikim, these 10 tanoim, who were connected to the 9 brothers who sold Yosef. Yes, Gilgal. They were connected to the 9 brothers of Yosef, and that's how, in some way, there is that connection. Why we had to wait so long for that to happen is a completely different question. That's a very, very complex question. It has to do with certain types of things, and it's really, we won't go into that. I'm just bringing, what I'm doing tonight basically is bringing out several interesting occurrences with Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef as a central character to try and understand what is going on here. Okay, let's look into this more carefully. I said certain important things last time, and I'll just repeat one or two things that I said, who Rabbi Akiva was. As I said last time, Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef was the Mashiach ben Yosef in his time. Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef was not a normal person in the regular sense. And as I've explained, in every generation, as we all know, there are individuals who have the power of becoming a Mashiach. That means that if the Jews are worthy at that moment in time, in that generation, then what happens is the Mashiach then arrives in that generation. Now, as we've said till now, there are 2 Mashiachs, not one. One is called the Mashiach ben Yosef, who comes first, and the other one is called the Mashiach ben David, who comes second. Okay? Now, Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef was the Mashiach ben Yosef. And interesting enough, there's another story in Rabbi Akiva's time, a very famous one, where he said that Bar Kokhba, who was a very great person, and he was a general, and he began to rebel against the Roman government. It was the last rebellion against the Roman government, and he died, Bar Kokhba, and all the people, of course, in the battle. But Rabbi Akiva said that man Bar Kokhba is the Mashiach. That's what it says in the Gemara. That Rabbi Akiva held that Bar Kokhba was the Mashiach. And then the other sages said that they disagree, or they simply said that grass will grow under your chin before the Mashiach arrives, which means that they felt that Bar Kokhba would never survive as Mashiach. But Rabbi Akiva felt that Bar Kokhba was a Mashiach, you see, and that this could be the beginning of the Messianic times, you see. That's basically the situation. Now, most people are confused about this Gemara, because most people think that Rabbi Akiva was wrong. They were wrong because Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kokhba was a Mashiach. Bar Kokhba was a general who brought up a great army of Jews to fight against the Romans. It was the last attempt by the Jews to free themselves from the Roman domination. It was the last attempt. And Bar Kokhba and thousands and thousands of Jews were killed at Beisar, you see. And the Jews held out for a long time after that. And finally, the last stronghold of the rebellion of Bar Kokhba was Masada. And the Jews finally died at Masada. Masada was part of the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, but it was the last holdout, you see. And that's the connection there. But essentially, this is what it was. Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kokhba was a Mashiach, and Rabbi Akiva, and many people who learned this Gemara said, well, obviously Rabbi Akiva was wrong. Bar Kokhba was not a Mashiach because Bar Kokhba died, and so on. That's number one. The answer to that is that Rabbi Akiva was not wrong. He was 1,000% correct. You see, Bar Kokhba was the Mashiach, except that the generation was not worthy of the Yemosa Mashiach or the Messianic times, and because of that, he died with them. You see, but it wasn't that he was wrong. Bar Kokhba had the potential of being the Mashiach. That's number one. Now, the second thing that I say is the following, because Rabbi Akiva is too great of a person to make that kind of mistake. You see, but men like Rabbi Akiva don't make mistakes like that. They don't walk around saying, this man is a Mashiach. It doesn't work like that, you see. Rabbi Akiva himself, who was astounding because we recognize the Mashiach very well. And it's not that the Chachamim or the sages of his time disagreed. They agreed that he was the Mashiach, except they felt he would not be successful. So Rabbi Akiva was correct. That's number one. Now, the second thing I say is that not only was Bar Kokhba Mashiach, but so was Rabbi Akiva. Except that Rabbi Akiva was the Mashiach ben Yosef, who then went ahead and identified the Mashiach ben David, who was Bar Kokhba. You see, that was the relationship of the two. And what Rabbi Akiva thought was that in that generation would come the Messianic time. That's what we really see from that particular medrash. And this gives us an enormous clue that we can begin to piece everything together. Okay, let's begin to weave this tapestry. Now, what we see first of all is that Rabbi Akiva was a Mashiach ben Yosef. A very quick review, as I've said, there were two Mashiachs, Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. And that in every generation there are two people who live, who have the power to be both of these. Except that they are not climaxed, or they do not become an accomplished Mashiach unless the generation is worthy. And as we've said before, that in order to take a potential Mashiach and make him an actual Mashiach, something extraordinary has to happen. A certain type of neshama has to come down from the Shemayim and rest on the neshama of that potential Mashiach. That neshama we call the Yechida. It is an unusual type of neshama. When it comes down on the neshama of the person who has the ability to be Mashiach, that neshama then suddenly invests the potential Mashiach with an enormous amount of chokhmah, so that suddenly he explodes into a messianic splendor. So that neshama is called the Yechida. It is also called the Melech HaMashiach, or the crown. Now, if you have a potential Mashiach who does not have that crown, he is not a Mashiach. He has a potential. He has to wait for that crown, or that crown neshama to come down. If it comes down, he becomes a full-blown Mashiach. If he doesn't come down, he simply remains a potential Mashiach, and that's it. And if it doesn't happen, it's got to wait for the next generation. Now obviously, since no Mashiach has ever appeared among the Jews, that neshama has never come down. It is hidden somewhere, it is waiting. Every once in a while, it moves, begins to agitate and move, and slowly begins to leave its chamber. But it always goes back, because what it is the Jews are never worthy of bringing it down. And because they're not worthy of bringing it down, no individual can become a Mashiach. Today, there are two people who live, both with the capacity to be a Mashiach. We of course have no idea who these people are, but the reason why we don't know that they're Mashiach, you see, or they don't have the power of Mashiach, is because that neshama still held captive in the Shemayim. Okay? That's very important to understand. The other thing that we've said before, why there are two Mashiachs, is like I said, the Mashiach ben Yosef represents the process of tahara, or purification from sins. He is the one that will climax the whole concept of the purification from sin. You see, he is the one that will bring all the Jews back to Israel. He is the one that will bring all the Jews back to belief in the Bnei Shalom, and he is the one who will teach the Torah to the Jews. It is the Mashiach ben Yosef that does that. Okay? We will get into that further on. The Mashiach ben David comes after that is completed, and he becomes a king, and he reigns over the Jews like a king for a certain period of time, and he elevates the Jews to the highest level possible, which is the level up to Olam Haba. So that's what each one does. The Mashiach ben Yosef is responsible for the removal of the damages of sin, and the Mashiach ben David, or what's called Tahara, and the Mashiach ben David is responsible for the elevation of Klal Yisrael to the highest levels of spirituality. That's called Kedusha. Okay? And both of them appear only after these processes reach their end. Now, Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef was a Mashiach. Clearly a Mashiach. And we know this, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto says this very clearly. And I went into last time the whole relationship of Rabbi Akiva to Yerovam ben Nevat. I will not discuss this now, and so on, but basically it's very clear that he was the Mashiach ben Yosef in his time. Now let's understand what happened. Clearly he looked at Bar Kokhba and he said, I see the Mashiach ben David, which means that he realized that Bar Kokhba was the Mashiach ben David, and therefore the Messianic period had the possibility of ensuing now. That tells us a very, very important thing about the time of Rabbi Akiva. Extremely important. And what does that tell us? That tells us that the time that Rabbi Akiva lived was what's called a critical period. There are certain periods in the history of the Jews when it is possible for the Mashiach to come in a much stronger and more efficient way. and there are other times when it's more difficult. You see, these are called critical periods. And the Jews have known in their history certain critical periods when the ability to bring the Messianic period was much easier than other times. We have been going over some of these periods. Matan Torah was one period, the time of Yeravim ben Nevat was another period, and now we're into another period, which is the time of Rabbi Akiva. That means that the time of Rabbi Akiva was very, very what? Was very, very sensitive to the possibility of ushering the Messianic age. Well, that's what it was. And that's why Rabbi Akiva instantly identified Bar Kokhba as the other key member of that team. Okay? Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students. Now, if Rabbi Akiva is the Mashiach, these 24,000 students are not what? They're no slouches. Which means that what Rabbi Akiva was giving over to these 24,000 students was the beginnings of the light of the Mashiach, which is a very unique way in understanding the Torah. That light has never come down yet, but pieces of that light do come down. And Rabbi Akiva, who captured that piece of light, since he was what? A potential Mashiach, began to dispense some of that light to some of his students. But in order to handle that type of light, you have to be very, very careful. You have to be a very, very high person. You have to be very, very careful in the way you do the mitzvahs. You have to be very, very careful in the way you treat another person. You have to be super careful about Lashon Hara and about any kinds of what? Any kinds of interactions or what? Or negative implications you will have another person. So that the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva have to be extra careful because of the gift that they were receiving. Remember who their Rebbe was. Their Rebbe was a Mashiach himself, or a potential Mashiach. But obviously they weren't up to that. They weren't capable of sustaining the powerful light that Rabbi Akiva was giving them. Why? Because they were not able to establish a cordial and an honorable relationship among them. Again, they fell prey to Lashon Hara, to jealousy, to that they did not respect each other in a really honest, in an honorable way. So they fell prey to all the jealousies and all the hostilities that go between people. So because of that, the Baruch Hashem says, you are not worthy of this. Not only you are not worthy, your generation is not worthy of these things too. That's why the 24,000 students died en masse. Why? They died en masse because they weren't simple students. They were the 24,000 lanterns or lights that will receive the light of Rabbi Akiva and to begin to distribute this to all the Jews. These were no 24,000 just what? Yeshiva Bochum. You see. They were an outstanding group. And that's why we feel so bad that they died. Because the loss of those 24,000 is not just the loss of 24,000 people, it's the loss of 24,000 channels or conduits, you see, from the Mashiach himself to Klal Yisrael. That's why the period of their death was a disaster for Klal Yisrael. It was an absolute disaster, and it symbolized the fact that the Mashiach was not coming in their time. That's what it was. The death of those 24,000 meant that the time of Rabbi Akiva will not be the immortal Mashiach. This is the significance of the mourning period between Pesach and Shavuot, you see. That's the significance. It was the loss of the Messianic period. So we see that the connection between Bar Kokhba and the loss of the 24,000 students, we begin to see there's a very direct connection. The failure of Bar Kokhba was directly connected to the failure of the 24,000 students. You see, these weren't separate events. This was really one event of one time, all connected to the notion that the time of Rabbi Akiva was what? Was very, very what? Sensitive, or very, very preparatory for the coming of the Mashiach himself. The fact of the matter is that when a person is given a certain commandment, a certain level of Kedusha, against that level of Kedusha, he's also given a certain level of a Yetzer Hara. The Baruch Hashem always has to balance it out. Why? To give the person free will. So no matter how high a person is, he's going to have a Yetzer Hara which is equal. And we mentioned this last week, because when we spoke about Yeravim ben Nevat, who was also a Mashiach, ben Yosef, and the possibilities of the Messianic period would have occurred then, he did a terrible sin. He built all kinds of idols and made Klal Yisrael worship Avodah Zarah. And the question was asked, how can a man who was Mamash Mashiach himself fall in such a way? And the answer that we gave, and I believe the last time, was That's the point. What it is, the Satan has the ability to go and to test you out wherever you're holding. So therefore, he has the ability to go and test the Mashiach out also. You see, even the Mashiach has a Yetzer Hara, because Yetzer Hara has the ability to go and test the Mashiach out. Except that when he goes to test the Mashiach out, he tests him out in the messianic aspects of his neshama. And that's the concept. Because whatever the Baruch Hu made was not complete. Remember, the Baruch Hu created this world incomplete. B'chasaron. It's incomplete. And the Baruch Hu said to us, you complete it. The fact that this world is incomplete, that means for every piece of kedusha or piece of truth, there is also an emptiness or a darkness connected to it. And the Baruch Hu said, it's your job to remove the darkness at every level. Because I created the world incomplete. And every level has its partial side and its incomplete side. Its complete side and its incomplete side. You have to eradicate the darkness of the world or the incomplete aspects of it so that the world only remains sholem or perfect. But that's your job. Now how many levels are there? There are levels that go from the smallest Jew to the Mashiach himself. So if we call that 50,000 levels, for example, then there are 50,000 levels of Kedusha. Each level has its own aspect of incompletion. And it's the job of every Jew who's connected to each one of these levels to complete that phase or that sphere. And that even is for the Mashiach himself. Because as we've said last time, it is possible for what? It is possible for the Jews to be zochet for Mashiach and for the Mashiach to fall. Or vice versa. Anything is possible, you see. And that's what it is here. Even though these students of Rabbi Akiva were very great, there's no question, but the Satan had the right to what? To examine them and to see to it that they build the Messianic times by virtue of their efforts. And they failed. On their level, they failed. From this concept, we can begin to understand about the four Tanoim who went into the garden. What went on over there? What was going on is a very interesting thing. These four men went into the garden. What garden? They wanted to go into the deepest light of the Torah. But what is the deepest light of the Torah? The deepest light of the Torah is called the Or Shel Mashiach. That's the highest light of all. The Messianic light, or the light which is associated with the crown Mashiach, the crown soul that we spoke before. That light is the deepest of all lights. That's the light that the Baruch Hu hid on the first day that he created it, and he hid it, so that mankind would not have it until the end. And that's the light which will one day come down, and that's what gives the ability of the Mashiach to be a Mashiach. That's why the Mashiach can simply sit down on his chair and look at every Jew, and tell every Jew just by one look, every sin that he did, all the thoughts that he had, where he came from every Gilgal, every time he's been down in the world, and all the things that happened to him, and exactly what he has to do to correct himself. And he simply look at a person and tell it to him. And I don't mean tell it to him by sometimes being right and sometimes being wrong, you see. But he can tell it to him with 1,000% accuracy. And he can tell the person what to do with 1,000% accuracy, so that as the person does something, it instantly sees its effect. Not only that, he can give a gzera, but he can give a bracha that always works, without question. There's no default with this. The power of Mashiach is enormous. In fact, the Talmud says, the Gemara says, in the time of Mashiach, when they come to Mashiach and they say, this country has rebelled against you. When they come to Mashiach ben David, or Mashiach ben Yosef, either one, when they come to Mashiach ben David and they say, these goyim have rebelled against you, he will say, oh yeah? Let that country have an earthquake. And suddenly there's an earthquake. Now that's no simple power. That's the power of the Mashiach, you see. What these four men wanted to do was to enter into the garden, of Torah talk, into that light, and take the light down. Why did they want to take the light down? Because obviously they all realized that now was a critical period. There was a possibility of bringing the Messianic era. In other words, if they would see to it, if they would really work hard, and the Yidden would be Zercha, the Mashiach can come now. That's why Rabbi Akiva was busy identifying Bar Kokhba as the Mashiach ben David, and these four realized, well, we can do that. Let's chaparayim, let's grab it. Let's go and bring down the Messianic light. So they went into the garden. Now I have no idea what that garden is, and I have no idea how to enter that garden. That garden is not a literal garden, it's a mystical garden. It means that their souls entered into an area of what? An area where the light of Mashiach appeared. Now what happened? They went in, but three of them didn't come out, or they came out very seriously damaged, and one did not. Why? Because the interesting thing is, like we said before, if these 4 people were simply going after some information, they went to a shir, and they want some information, nope, so they didn't know the answer. The guy doesn't go out crazy because he doesn't have an answer to a question. But they didn't go for a shir. It wasn't a normal shir. They went for what? They went after the life of the shir. And that's a dangerous task. Why is that dangerous? For one basic reason. We said before that the Mashiach can come in one of 2 ways. Either he comes because of the merit of the Jews, or he comes because it is his time to come. What the Banishim said is the following: I will allow 6,000 years from the time of Adam Rishon, and you will have to fix up the world. You must make it complete. You see, in every generation, if all the Jews do tshuva, of all the Jews, develop a certain level of Yerushalayim, then the Banishim says, you will merit the Mashiach, and I will give you this messianic life and this messianic period. I will redeem the Jews because you will have what? Have requested this of me. You will have made it. You will have created it yourself because you will have done tshuva and been tzaddikim. But let's say you fail. Let's say you Jews do not do tshuva, or you continue to do the sins which what? Keep away the Mashiach, which bring the Jews into exile and so on. You keep on doing the sins of lashon hara and what? And jealousy and sin of chinim, hating other Jews for no reason at all. You keep on doing these terrible things to each other. You keep on doing, right? Then I will not bring the Mashiach because of your efforts, because you people don't deserve it. But I will bring the Mashiach in my own time, and in my own way. My own time is called the Kates. The Kates means the end. And there is a certain date, which is what? Which the Banishim knows. And the Mashiach must come by that date. It is the last date. And by that date, the Mashiach must arrive. Nobody knows that date. Or rather, there were only 2 people who knew that day, called the Kates. And that was Yaakov Avinu and Daniel. Also, and I've also heard Yosef knew it too. You see, no one else ever knew that. In fact, Yaakov wanted to tell it to his sons, but the Banishim would not let him do it. So only those people knew what that day is. It is a day in history, which on that day, if the Mashiach has not arrived till then through the merits of the Jews, he must come. But what the Banishim says, if I have to bring him, it won't be good because I bring him. If you bring him through your merits and through your Mesiras Nefesh and your dedication, then you will bring him in a very great way. But if I have to bring him, it will only come through suffering and through great difficulty. These 4 realized that then was a period when the Mashiach can come easier than at other times. But does that mean that he would come without any merit? No, it wasn't the case. It wasn't the designated day, because the designated day had not arrived. In fact, it hasn't even arrived today. In what? In 1987. The designated day is still obviously up ahead. How do we know that? Because if it would be before, Mashiach would be here by now. You see, which means that the case or that designated day has still not arrived. That means that the ability of the Mashiach to come at that point depended on the merit of the Jews, but it was more sensitive to their merit. You see, the Banishim was listening better. It was easier for him to come. So these 4 Tanoim with Rabbi Akiva, who was the Mashiach ben Yosef, realized that now is the time. If we do something extraordinary, maybe we can come and bring back that light. And that's what they did. But where is that light? Where is the light of the Mashiach? You see, where is it? When they ran after it and they went to the garden, where was that garden? And I tell you that garden, it's incredibly dangerous to go into that garden. Because you know where that garden is? Who has an idea of where that garden is? Wait. The fact is, and this is the fact, when the Jews do mitzvahs, every time a Jew does a mitzvah, you know what he does? He brings down a kedusha, a spiritual power from the Shemayim into his neshama. When a Jew does a sin, then what happens to that power? Then that power is forced to go into the hands of the Satan. You see, and the Satan absorbs the power and he uses it against the Jews. That's the thing. The greatest power of all is the power of the Shekhinah. Where is the Shekhinah today? You all know the expression, the Shekhinah is in Golus. Shekhinah begalusa. What does that mean that the Shekhinah is in exile? What it means is that the power of the Shekhinah, or the power of all this light, lies buried in the deepest level of the Tumah, or the deepest level of the darkness. It's in a spiritual desert, wherever that is, or whatever that is, that's at the bottom of creation, and the Shekhinah is in that midst. Why? What drove the Shekhinah to that depth? We did, through our sins. And the fact is that we are the only ones who can bring the Shekhinah out. But until we bring the Shekhinah out, it stays there. Therefore, when these four Tanoim wanted to go for the light of the Mashiach, that light of the Mashiach is connected to the Shekhinah. But where is the Shekhinah? The Shekhinah is in the darkest levels of the darkness of Tumah, which means that these four Tanoim had to enter into the Tumah itself, into a very dark place, which is the domain of the Satan himself, in order to extricate that light before its time. That was the danger. This was not ordinary question they were after, or some ordinary information. They were after the highest light of all. But that highest light, because of the sins of the Jews, lay in the lowest of the places. And these four Tanoim had to go to that low place, you see, to bring back that light. And that's why it's so dangerous. Now you begin to understand what happened. The only one who came out in any normal fashion was Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because he was the Mashiach ben Yosef. And we will go into this in the future, but the Mashiach ben Yosef has a very unusual quality. The Mashiach ben Yosef is an individual, very different than the Mashiach ben David. The Mashiach ben Yosef is a very individual who is like Yosef HaTzadik. What was the uniqueness of Yosef HaTzadik? Where did Yosef live for most of his life? In Egypt. Were there from Jews in Egypt? Was there a minion around the corner? Was there a Beis Medrash? Yosef was stuck in the worst part of Mitzrayim, and he was all alone. Yet Yosef had the power and the kedusha to remain a tzaddik. He was greater than his what? All his brothers in the Beis Medrash of their father Yaakov. Yosef was greater in Egypt than his brother was in what? In the Beis Medrash of Yaakov. Can you imagine the power of Yosef? And only a Mashiach ben Yosef has that power. Only a true Mashiach ben Yosef, or someone who's connected to that type of neshama, has the ability to live amongst the greatest tumah, amongst the greatest darkness, and the greatest evils, and still not touch his neshama. And Rabbi Akiva was like that. Because when did Rabbi Akiva start to learn Torah? When he was 40 years old. What was Rabbi Akiva doing for the first 40 years? He wasn't learning. In fact, he said that, I hated Talmidei Chachamim. I used to hate people who learned before I was 40 years old. So Rabbi Akiva for 40 years was in some klipa, was in some tumah. That's exactly where he was. He was accustomed to being in these places like that. So it was no foreign place for him, but he was able to reconcile these two forces of what? Of a klipa, or a place of darkness, or tumah, and incredible kedusha. So he was able to enter into the domain of what? The Satan, and come out well. But the other three were not. They entered in, and what? It was too much for them, and each one suffered his own way. Now let's analyze how each one suffered. You see, why is it that one died, one became a min, and one became insane? What is that type of an adjustment? Well, let's discuss that, and we'll see something very interesting about some people. Every person that you know, including yourself, is composed of two aspects: a neshama and a body, a soul and a body. Those two aspects, in certain ways, have two different types of drives or inclinations. The neshama is driven to what? To kedusha. The neshama is driven to holiness. It's driven to truth. It's driven to a higher level of existence. The body is driven to pleasure. It's driven to a different type of what? Fulfillment. So the neshama and the guf have two different ways of fulfilling themselves. The way of the guf fulfilling itself is called the Yetzer Hara, and the way of the neshama fulfilling itself is called the Yetzer Tov, or the good inclination, versus the evil inclination. In every person, there is a certain relationship between the two. Every person has a certain relationship between his Yetzer Hara and his Yetzer Tov. In certain people, the Yetzer Hara is much stronger. In other people, the Yetzer Tov is much stronger. So that there's a certain type of what? Interaction, or what we call like a ratio that exists between the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov in each individual. The kind of ratio which exists between these two forces tells us what? The spiritual level of that person, and how easy it is for him to accept spiritual information. The more a person is ingrained in his Yetzer Hara, the more he's ingrained in physical, material things, the more difficult it is for him to sit in a shiur and hear very high things. Not easy, you see. The more a person is ingrained in his Yetzer Tov, the more he's ingrained in kedusha, the more humble he is, or the greater Yireh Shamayim is, the easier it is for him to sit and listen to words of very high what? Torah. Now, depending on the level of the individual, if you have a person who suddenly listens to Torah, which is too high for them, they will begin to react in different ways. And we call that a certain type of what? Spiritual adaptation. And there are four ways of adapting. Okay? Again, when you have an individual and suddenly he sees a truth, he sees an emes, a truth, which is higher than his ratio or his ability to receive it, it will force several different possible reactions. Okay. One, we're dealing with an individual who hears an emes, he sees a certain truth, and suddenly he sees it and he's big enough. His neshama and his guf are in very good ratio, and we said that the neshama and guf are in phase. They move along together. They're in phase, you see. So they can handle this very great truth which is suddenly realized by that person. Then you have people who are not in phase. Now the one who is in phase means that his neshama and guf have an appropriate balanced ratio. He can listen to very great truths, you see, to a certain amount of truth. For example, let's say that his neshama guf ratio is 5 to 5. Okay? That's a good ratio. That's a balanced ratio. So therefore, he can listen to a certain truth of number 5. But if you give that person a number 7 truth, which is a higher level truth, if you go from 1 to 10 this way, right? Suddenly, that number 7 level truth is hitting a person who's only a 5 to 5. That's too much for him to handle. Too much. It's too pure for him. If you give him a number 3 level truth, he will easily be able to deal with it. You see what I'm saying? So therefore, the ability of a person to listen to information or accept it, in terms of ruchnistic information, depends on what his ratio is and how high the emes is. The value of the emes. I'm being very mathematical here, but that's the best way to understand it. This is really what goes on. But I'm giving you a mathematical interpretation. There's the ratio of a person between his Yetzirah and his Neshama, okay? And then there's the value or the power of the truth which is coming out. For example, if a malach suddenly appeared in this room, everyone in this room would probably die. Why is that? Why? If suddenly he revealed himself, or you saw the total emes of a malach, probably everyone in the room would probably die. Why? Because everyone in this room is, let's say, a 5 to 5, and a malach is a 9. And the power of a 9, that kind of revelation, suddenly that type of spiritual awareness, that emes is so powerful that the neshama would pop from the ghost. You see? And that once happened. When the Jews went to Har Sinai and they received the Torah, what happened is, in the first 2 commandments, the Bnei Shalom decided he would tell them the commandments. You see? So therefore, he basically commanded the Jews the first 2 mitzvahs. I am the Lord thy God who took thee out of Egypt, and so on, and the second one. Okay? As soon as they heard the voice of the Bnei Shalom, they all died. They all died. All the Jews died on Har Sinai. And the Bnei Shalom were again resurrected the dead. That's what the Medrash says. Why did they die? Very simple mathematics. No b'chachmas. Because all of them were, let's say, 5 5s or whatever the story is, and then suddenly hit a 10. You can't live on a 10. You see. That's what it is. Okay, let's go on here. Now, what we see is, so therefore, depending on the guf neshama ratio that you have, in terms of your Yetzirah and Yetzirah Tov, that determines your ability to receive spiritual information or the level of emes. You see. And if it's too intense, it will affect you adversely. If it's too little, it will not affect you and it will easily go through. Okay? That's basically what it is. It is always best for a person to stick with the kind of information that more or less is what is on his level or lower than his level. If it's lower than his level, he won't be gaining anything. If it's on his level, he'll do fine. If it's higher than his level, he's going to have problems. If it's just a little bit higher than his level, that's good, because that will force a growth. If it's too high, it can produce negative effects. What are the negative effects? Okay. Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef was obviously, his Yetzirah Tov ratio was so high that he was able to look in the faces of all of Mashiach and come out. So that he walked out with the light of the Mashiach. Right? He walked out with it. Because he was in phase. The other 3 were out of phase. That was their problem. Elisha ben Abuya was out of phase. He was. But what happened to Elisha ben Abuya? He became an apikoros. He refused to believe. Why? How did he deal with the incredible stress that was suddenly produced on him? The threat that came to him because he saw such a powerful emes. What did he do? How did he deal with the instability that was suddenly introduced into his psyche or into his neshama or to his what? Into his guf neshama kind of combination because of the information he saw. There was only one way he dealt with it. He said, he denied it. It's not true. Exactly. Denial. What is this? It's not true. He denied it. He had to deny it. Because there's no way that he could sustain that level. But since he had entertained too high of a level, The only way for him to remain alive was to deny it in a certain way. So essentially that's what happened. Shimon ben Azai died. What happened? How did he deal with it? The truth is he didn't deal with it. He couldn't handle it. So his neshama popped out. He wasn't strong enough to handle it. So therefore, who is greater? Elisha ben Avuya or Shimon ben Azai? Elisha ben Avuya was the greater. You can see by the way you handle the crisis, the level of your neshama. Obviously, Elisha ben Avuya was able to sustain the information, but he denied it. But it didn't damage him in such a way where he died. Whereas Ben Azai, obviously, was even weaker than that. So he couldn't even defend himself, and he simply died. Shimon ben Zoma, he went insane. How did he handle the information? He was obviously the weakest. How did he handle it? He couldn't deny it, and he couldn't die. What happened? He suspended his rational faculty. He stopped thinking, and he went insane. He no longer thought like a rational being. He suspended the intellectual function. That's the way he handled the crisis, you see, which is a very low level of handling, you see. But these are different ways that people will deal with crisis. And this is very important. This, what I told you now, is extremely important. This concept of the Yetzer phase relationships is extremely important. Because what it is the determinant which tells us to what extent the level of information is that you can receive. You see, that's what it tells us. Not only that, it tells us each generation what that generation can conceive. The Bnei Shalom will never allow too great of a light in any generation. Why? Because if the Bnei Shalom allowed such a great light, what would happen to that generation? It would be disastrous. Therefore, the Bnei Shalom, as the generation sins and gets lower and lower, what must the Bnei Shalom do to the light of truth? He must lower it, you see. He must lower it for our own self-preservation. We have to be zoicha to less and less emet so that we can survive. It's not that the Bnei Shalom is holding it from us in a way just to punish us in that sense. We have dictated our own punishment. We have denied ourselves the ultimate truths because we have made ourselves unfit to receive them. You see? And that accounts why, from generation to generation, as men sin more and more, we know less and less. Why there are fewer and fewer the tzaddikim, and fewer and fewer the great men. Because that is what's necessary to keep the world surviving. And we see this from the model of the 4 Tanoim who went into the garden, you see. That's exactly what goes on in the Jews in every generation and with each Jew, you see. And it's exactly what happens even anywhere, you see. If you sit down, and I know sometimes a person may go to a shiur and hear something that's too high for him, or too much. He can't handle that level of insight. Because something wreaks havoc with the Yetzer Hara. Not the Yetzer Tov. His Yetzer Hara can't handle it. Because with that level of truth, the man can't fool himself anymore. The person can't give into his Yetzer Hara. He can't be the Baal Kaiva that he wants. He can't be the Baal Kaiva that he wants, you see. He can't run after the satisfactions. He can't run after he can't be arrogant anymore. When there's too much truth sitting in front of you, you cannot be arrogant. All these stockbrokers that thought they were the greatest things, what? God gives to what? God gives to investment banking. Suddenly was decimated when the stock market fell 500 points. With too much truth. Suddenly they saw an incredible vulnerability. It's the same thing. If the Bnei Shalom reveals too much truth, or a person sees too much truth, he can't deal with it, and what happens is, he must in some way form some kind of a defensive posture. And what can't take the truth is the Yetzer Hara. When a man lives with the Yetzer Hara, when it's a strong companion, you see, when it's really a good friend of his, then it's very hard for him to hear things of high truth. Because the Yetzer Hara won't be able to survive, and he becomes very, very irritated, very insecure, and very unstable. Obviously, these 4 men knew there was a risk involved, and they wanted to bring the light of the Mashiach at a time when it was questionable if the Jews were zeicha or not. And they failed, because the Jews were not zeicha. How do we know the Jews weren't zeicha? Because Bar Kokhba died, and the 24,000 students died also. That instantly told us, see, these were not separate incidents. These are all connected. And that's what it was. It was a risk. They had to go into a very dark place to see it, and they all came out damaged. They all came out damaged. Now, it's a fascinating study to understand how they came out damaged. What did they see? But these are very deep, mysterious things, you see. But that's the very deep thing. But this essentially is what happened at that time. It's because that time was a critical period to bring the Mashiach, and the fact that they were trying to bring the highest light, and the fact that they were taking this light from a very dark place where the Shina was, that put them at great risk, and only one of them, Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, came out, because he fundamentally was Mashiach ben Yosef. The other three were connected in some way to that, but they weren't great enough, and they all sustained damages. Now, we can understand also why Moshe Rabbeinu was jealous of Rabbi Akiva. Of course he was jealous of Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva came out. That means Rabbi Akiva was a very strange creature, really, and I recall Rabbi Akiva was a freak. And I'll tell you why he's a freak. Very simply, Rabbi Akiva was a full-blown Mashiach without a nation to redeem. You ever hear such a thing? Such a thing has never happened to the Jews. When Moshe Rabbeinu went out with the Jews from Egypt, he was also Mashiach. And then when he went up on the mountain, and the Jews worshipped the golden calf, the Rebbeinu said to Moshe Rabbeinu, go down. Go, lech rei, get thee down. Now we know go down from the mountain. But what the Rebbeinu says is go down from your Mashiachas. You are no longer the Mashiach. Why? Because the Jews are no longer worthy of redemption. What good is a king without a nation? There's no kings, no malchus without a malucha. You see? So therefore Moshe Rabbeinu was Ois Mashiach. So Moshe Rabbeinu had reached the 49th level of Bina, what's called Mem Teshari Bina. There are 50 levels to Bina, and Moshe reached the 49th. Why did he only reach the 49th? Because the Jews worshipped the golden calf. There was only one man who reached the 50th. Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef. He reached the top. And because he reached the 50th, how? Because he went into Pardes and he came out. He succeeded in becoming almost a Mashiach for all practical purposes. And then when he came out, there was no one around to redeem. You see? So when Moshe looked up ahead and saw him, he says he was astounded. He said, my God, you've got a man who reached the 50th level. That guy's a Mashiach. He's a walking Mashiach. Just about. You see? That's why he was jealous. Moshe Rabbeinu was not jealous of everyone. But Moshe Rabbeinu was jealous of Rabbi Akiva. Because Rabbi Akiva reached the 50th level, what he failed to achieve. So we understand the relationship of that medrash to the whole story of Rabbi Akiva. Again, all these things are connected. You see, there were some amazing things happening at that time. 10 martyrs who died, okay? Rabbi Akiva, Rav Chutzpah HaMeturgeman, Rabbi Yeshua, Rav Hananya ben Chakinai, Rav Hananya ben Tulajan, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, Rav Eliezer ben Shamua, Rav Yehuda ben Bava, Rav Yehuda ben Doma. These are the 10 who were killed by the Romans under the Hadrianic persecution. Okay. All 10. And the question that we have to ask, what happened? What happened? Now there's a very fundamental principle. And the fundamental principle is the following. When the Jews reach a period, and that period, you see, is capable of bringing the Mashiach in an easier way, that means that there is a greater inclination or possibility for them to do it. What happens is the Sultan at that point fights even harder, and he runs up to the Baruch Shalom and tries to accuse them of everything, which way, whatever it is. He really goes to town because the kitrug, or the accusations of Klal becomes stronger, because when the Jews are about to come to their end or to their perfection, then the Midas Hadin becomes stronger and stronger. It examines. For example, when you go into your boss, you see, if you have a job and you do your job and so on, the boss will not necessarily always investigate how well you're working. But if you walk in and you ask for a raise, what's the first thing he does? A personnel reevaluation. 1 minute. You want a raise? Okay, let's see how good of a job you were doing to begin with. You see, which means that whenever you go higher, you're subject to a greater scrutiny. That's all it is. That's what it is. It is the same thing with Shemayim. The higher you are, the more subject you are to examination. And when the Jews were at a point in the time of Akiva, when they were much closer to bringing the Mashiach, they were also subject to a higher examination. That's what it was. What happens if they fail the examination? Then what happens is that the Sultan becomes even stronger. When the Jews have the ability to bring the Mashiach, and they don't, then what happens is the Sultan becomes even more powerful than before. More powerful than before. It has a lot, but what we see therefore is the following, that when the Jews failed to bring the Messianic period, right? When it failed to bring the Messianic period, the Sultan went up and says, wait a minute, look, these Jews can't even redeem themselves. So then why do you allow them to exist? Look how easy you have made it for them. Look, they were just inches away from bringing Mashiach. Look who you had down. You had Rabbi Akiva down there. Look who you had. Look at these incredible Tanoim that you have. And with these men living, we don't have anyone today. But look who these men were. These men were astounding, and there were hundreds of others. With these men living there, why is it that the Jews can't manage to get their act together? You see, if they can't manage to get their act together with a man like Rabbi Akiva, and so on, so when are they going to get their act together? Why do you tolerate their existence? So then the Mitzvah decides and demand their destruction. So what does the Banishim do? The Banishim says, no, I cannot destroy them because they are the essence of the world. You see, the Jews are the essence of the world, and I must exert my Rahmanas. So the Banishim exerts his Rahmanas, and he says to the Sultan, I refuse to listen to you. I will punish the Jews. I will punish the Jews, it is true. But I will not listen to you to destroy them. But see, the Sultan is not put off so simply. This man comes with enormous power, because the power of the Sultan is the power of the sins of the Jews. The Kitrug, which is the power of the Sultan, right, which is the power of every Ayin Hara, is your sins. The Sultan is a mirror, or it's a reflection of your sins. That's all he is. He's a complete robot. He's designed exactly according to your chesed. You see, each person has his own Sultan, who is an exact replica of your chesed. That's exactly what a Sultan is. And therefore, that replica then goes up to the Baruch Shem and shows himself in front of the Bezdin. And the Bezdin looks at that replica and instantly is aware of all the sins. That's all it is. The Sultan doesn't have to say anything. He simply goes to the Baruch Shem and models in front of the Bezdin Shemala, if I may be so coarse. But that's all it is. Because as soon as the Shemayim looks at him, they can see the exact configuration of the sins of every particular Jew. So the process of accusation against any Jew, against all of Israel, is simply that the Sultan simply has to appear in front of the Bezdin. And his essence or his design is itself an accusation. So, what happens? The Sultan, after the failure of the generation of Rabbi Akiva to bring the Mashiach, has a very powerful thing. So the Banishim is now in a very big quandary, Kaviyachal. You see. And what does the Banishim do? The Banishim exerts Rachmanis. But in order to exert Rachmanis, the Banishim must pay a price. And when I mean pay a price, he pays a price because that's the system that he designed. He designed it so that we will bring Olam Haba by our efforts. You have to remember how it started. You see, the Banishim praised the Neshama to give him Olam Haba, but the Neshama demanded from God that he create Olam Haba by his own efforts. So the Banishim therefore set up the world based on din, or based on what? Justice, where you have to earn what you get. Once that concept was established, then you can't fool around with it anymore. You can't say, well, I'll give you Olam Haba even if you do sins. Can't do that. You've got to be consistent. So therefore, when the Banishim wants to exert Rachmanis, he's got to deviate from the strict rule of justice. And that's not an easy thing to do. Now the way he deviates is the deepest mystery of all. You see, it's called Anugas HaYichud, and we surely will not go into that. We've gone into certain aspects of it before. But in order for the Banishim to deviate, he has to give the Sultan Kedusha. He's got to form an enormous amount of Kedusha. Now when Adam sinned for the first time, and there was a great accusation hurled against Adam, what the Banishim did was to take the Shechina and put it into the hands of the Sultan. That's what allowed the world to survive. You see. What allowed the world to survive now? And what allowed the world to survive in the time of Rabbi Akiva? Very simply, what the Banishim said to the Sultan, in the way that he was able to what? To turn around the accusation or the kitrug, he said, I will give you 10 incredible neshamas, and I will give them in your hands. And when those neshamas go into your hands, you will be satisfied, and you no longer will demand the what? You will no longer demand the annihilation of the Jews. So the Banishim took the 10 martyrs. That was the price that he paid to allow the Jews to survive even after the failure to bring the Mashiach in the time of Rabbi Akiva. That's what happened, to allow them to survive. Now you may say, well, how did they survive after that? After that started a very unique period. Because if you remember, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and the Romans dominated the Jews. But whether or not the Jews would escape Rome, which was Asa, or not, depended on whether or not they would have brought Mashiach. when Rabbi Akiva lived in that generation, it was the last time that the Jews had the ability to save themselves from what was about to arrive. And what was about to arrive was the last and greatest of the decrees against the Jews. Since you failed to bring the Mashiach, what the Rebbe says, I will now put you into a new type of punishment that I have never really done before in this way. You will go into a golus, or an exile, for the next 2,000 years. That was decided at that point in time, you see. What the Rebbe did was to trade off with the Satan. Whereas the Satan demanded the annihilation of the Jews, the Rebbe said, no, I will simply put them in exile. I will take them out of Eretz Yisrael. I will destroy, take them away from Kedusha. I will take away all this from them, and I will put them among the Goyim. They will live, and they will be oppressed by the Goyim, by Esav, you see, himself. But I can't do that. The Rebbe says, I cannot do this unless I sacrifice 10 of the highest neshamas as a price that I have to pay to satisfy the accusation, so that there is no accusation rose against the Jews in order to annihilate them. And that was the death of the Asura Gemalchus. Why did 10 of these martyrs die at that point in time? Because again, it was that time that the Mashiach was supposed to arrive. Hence it was that time that was most dangerous for the Jews. Just like those 4 Tanoim. What? They were at risk. They wanted to bring the light of the Mashiach the 4th time. It was a risk for them. They had to go into the darkest place to bring that light. It's the same thing. It is a risk for the Jews to have the ability to bring the Mashiach and then fail. Because then the accusation is much stronger. And we see what happened to those 3 Tanoim who didn't come out right. You see. It was the same thing with the Jews. The Satan wanted to damage the entire nation of Israel. But the Persians refused to allow that damage. But in order to keep that damage from hitting the Jews, the Persians threw in 10 neshamas. And those were the 10 martyrs. 10 martyrs to allow the Jews to survive even though they failed to bring the Mashiach. And 10 martyrs which allowed the Jews to go into a golus. Listen to what I say. We think that golus was the punishment. Golus wasn't the punishment. Golus was the way that the Persians saved us against what had happened at that point in time. Because is it better to go into exile, or is it better to be destroyed? What choice is there? Exile is the much less of the 2 evils. But you don't realize that exile requires a price. Because exile is a schus against ibud or annihilation. But it demands a price. And that price was the 10 martyrs. And the highest price was Rabbi Akiva himself. Because Rabbi Akiva was the Mashiach. So the Buddha said, finally, that 9 of these are not enough. I need a 10th man to represent me. I need a 10th man to represent the Shekhinah that was damaged. And there's only one man who can represent the Shekhinah, and that's the Mashiach ben Yosef himself. So I require you, of all people. So Moshe Rabbeinu said to Bereshit, how is it possible that such a man can be zeicha to the 50th level of understanding and die such a death? So the Bereshit says, it is my decree. You see. But basically we understand what that decree is. When the Bereshit said, it is my decree, it means it is my way of saving the Jews. When they would not be zocha to the Mashiach in the time of Rabbi Akiva. In the time of Rabbi Akiva, when they will abuse the purpose and the function of Rabbi Akiva will be needed to save them for the next, 2,000 years. So this is what happened. This was the final end to the messianic dream in that period of time. It was the final end. So why do we say the Asura Gemalchus of Tisha B'Av? Because what? The Asura Gemalchus, the death of the 10 martyrs, is a separate tragedy. The first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. The second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. But there was something about the death of the 24,000 Talmidim, which is different. And I told you what that is. That's the loss of the 24,000 channels of the light of Mashiach. There's something about the death of these 10 that was different than any other time. There were many times that tzaddikim died. Many times, very great tzaddikim died. But since the history of the Jews, there has never been a situation where this kind of 10 died for that purpose. And these 10 died for the specific purpose of allowing the Jews to survive in exile for the next 2,000 years. So if we survive among the Goyim, and if the Goyim are not able to destroy us, even though we live in all the Goyim, even though we're expelled from one country to another, and we go under inquisitions and pogroms and everything, why are we still here? You know why? Because of the schus of the 10 martyrs. It is this schus which allows us to survive in whatever persecution we see. That's the essence of these 10. And that's why we see these 10 on Tisha B'Av as an extra measure of what? Of grief. And also on Yom Kippur, to realize what it is that's involved. This is no slight matter. So therefore we see the whole period of Rabbi Akiva, and we see how by understanding the basic idea of who Rabbi Akiva was, and what he was supposed to do, we see how it all fits in, and suddenly all these separate little stories in Midrashim suddenly fill into one thing, and we see that they're all connected in a very deep way. This is the significance of Rabbi Akiva, and it's the significance of the messianic possibilities at his point in time. Next time, we will go further into history, and we will again examine a different point in time, which is much closer to our own, and see what happened at that point. The question is asked, and I'm only going to briefly talk about it, how can we be zeicher to the light of Mashiach in our time when we're the lowest generation of all? If our Yetzer ratio and our phase relationship is so little, it's so small, that the type of light that we can only see has to be very little. How can we be zeicher to receive the Mashiach in our time or the next generation? But let's say it's our generation. How is that possible? How can a generation out there where 90% of the Jews are not even from anymore, and can't even read Hebrew, whatever the story is, how can they be zeicher to the light of the Mashiach itself? Very good question. I'm only going to answer that only very partially, very simply. The ability to receive the light of Mashiach depends on which main factor. How big your Yetzer Hara is. That's really what it is. Because that's which disturbs our ability. How big the Yetzer Hara is. When the Mashiach appears, that Yetzer Hara will have disappeared in almost all men. That will be altered. What will be altered? That's what it says. We're going to go into this much more in depth. Umor Hashem es levavachem. The Baruch Hashem will do a milah or a circumcision on the heart of every Jew. What that means, what does it mean a circumcision on the heart? A circumcision on the heart is the removal of the essence of the Yesatan, of the Yetzer Hara in you. Once that's removed, then there's no more problem of receiving whatever emes there is in front of you. The problem is that Yetzer Hara, and what the Mashiach will have the ability to do is to ultimately, completely matahir, the Mashiach ben Yosef, mind you, to totally eradicate the last vestiges of the Yetzer Hara, and that will give us the ability, even though we're very small, to receive that kind of light, because there will not be a disturbance. You see, and we won't be out of sync or out of balance. The other point is that our neshamas are very pure, and we don't realize that. Even though we're very small, our neshamas are very pure because we've gone through so much suffering. Because we've gone through so much and so much. The Jews who live at this time are the purest of all Jews that have ever lived since the time of the Jews at Sinai. Do you know that? We're not the greatest in Kedusha. We're not the highest, but we are the purest. You see, that's right, we are the purest. It means that the amount of hate, or the amount of what's called kilkul, or damage, which is in the neshama, is almost gone. Then the people of the neshama who live today, the purity, the tahara, which exists today, is much greater than in the time of Baal Shem Tov, much greater than the time of the Rambam, much greater than the time of Rabbi Akiva, and much greater than the time of Eliyahu Navi or Yeshaya. We are the highest level of neshamas when it comes to the aspect of tahara, not Kedusha, because we're the smallest in terms of Kedusha, but we're the highest in terms of purity. Yes, it's hard to understand. There's a mystery in that, which I will not go into. It's the mystery of Hanogat Yichud itself. It's the way that the Yetzer or the Satan is blinded, you see. But that's the fact. It's very strange. And we find it also. We find a very interesting thing. And I once said it's a very interesting story, which I say over. There was a very great man who, Rav Shimshon Atapolia, the Ari once said something, a very deep mystery, that he wrote a number of things and nobody understood what he wrote. And finally, Rav Shimshon Atapolia had figured it out, or not clear, I remember the story again. He had figured, or someone had figured it out and appeared to him in a dream and told him what the secret was. And nobody else knew it but Rav Shimshon Atapolia, who was like the greatest Kabbalist in his time. And then after that, it was printed in the back of Haggadah's form so that all of us can read what nobody knew at his time. And it's amazing. The greatest people in the time of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria could not understand, they were not zeicher to know this. And all of us are zeicher to know that by paying $2.50 in Eichler's or some phone store, we could figure it out what no one else knew before. Why? Very simply, because our souls are much holier than theirs, even though they're much smaller. What you don't understand is that there are two different criteria. There's what's called Tumah or Kilkul and what's called Kedusha. Kedusha is the power or the level of spirituality that the Neshama has, how high it is in terms of its spirituality. Tumah or kilkel has to do with how damaged it is. So you can have a very high neshama with a great deal of damage, or a very small neshama who's very pure. You see? It's like a diamond. Exactly. You can have a what? You can have a 20-carat diamond, right? Which has some black soot around it. If you take a 20-carat diamond and you throw it into the ashes, and it comes out, it has black soot around it, right? And then you can have a 1-carat diamond, which is perfectly shiny. You see? That's exactly the thing. The same thing here. Our neshamas are like little 1-carat diamonds, or maybe quarter-carat diamonds. Okay? Quarter-carat diamonds. Like that? Okay, but even though we're quarter-carat diamonds, we are much purer, much less flawed than the 20-carat diamonds that used to live before. And that's why we could be zoicha to the light of Mashiach where no one could be before. Because what keeps the Mashiach away is not how big your neshama is, rather, but how filthy it is. Yes, well, but that's a different criteria. But it's how filthy it is, how darkened it is, how flawed it is. That's what holds the Mashiach back, not how big it is. You see, that's the point. You can make a lot of little quarter-carat diamonds and make a beautiful piece of jewelry, couldn't you? Or you take one big 10-carat diamond and make a stunning piece too. That's not the problem. The problem is the flaws in the diamond, and that's the essence of the matter. Again, there are two different criteria. There's what's called Kedusha and Tahara, and most people make this confusion. Kedusha means how powerful the neshama is in terms of the spiritual energies or abilities that it possesses. Tahara means how flawed it is in terms of the sins that person did. You can have a great tzaddik like Yerovam ben Nevat, who had an enormous neshama in terms of its power, but he had enormous damage on it because of the sins he did. And then you have a smaller person who has a little neshama, meaning that he doesn't have such spiritual sensitivity, but he's a person who maybe has done very few sins. You see, one is tahara, or the amount of sins that you do, and the other is kedusha, or how much spiritual awareness that you have. And these are two different criteria. And the rule is, the more Klal Yisrael goes in time, the further it goes away from the beginning of creation, the smaller the souls get. But since the further they go away, they suffer more, and the Jews undergo more and more persecutions, and more trials and tribulations in history. They're being cleansed constantly. They're constantly in a washing machine. You see, that's what it is. The last 2,000 years is like we're living in a washing machine. That's what it is. So by the time you come out, you may be incredibly shrunk, but you are clean. See the point? The point is, you can have a beautiful piece of clothes, a magnificent dress from designers, whatever the story is, but it could be filthy, you see. And you can have a plain dress that could be really immaculate. It's the same thing. And that's essentially what it is. We are shrunk, but we are very, very clean. And the fact that most Jews are not frum is simply an indication on how shrunk we are, how small we are, not on how clean we are. That's a very critical thing, because most of those Jews who are not frum are not frum not because they choose not to be frum, but because they don't know any better. That's the key to it. The key to it, that when a Jew does a sin without free will attached to it, no damage ensues. So now 90% of those Jews who are not even religious have no damage to the neshamas, because their irreligiosity comes from what? Total lack of awareness of what frumkeit is. They weren't brought up with frum parents. They don't know anything. Therefore, their irreligiosity does not damage their soul at all. They still remain pure. That's the point. That's why if you say to me, how can all those Jews out there who are not even religious receive Mashiach? I tell you that's exactly the point. It's the way they're not religious. If they were not religious because they were Rishayim, because suddenly they all decided, they knew better, and they decided not to do anything, that would make them Rishayim. And Rishayim are very bad. But these people out there are not Rishayim. These are called Tinik Shenishba. These are all babes who are captivated. The children who are captivated among the Goyim who don't know any better. And that's their halacha. So the fact is, these people really, their religiosity does not retard the Mashiach from coming necessarily, nor does it make them Rishayim. That's a very, very important thing to understand. That's how it's possible for the Mashiach to come in our generation. The essential concept is the fact is that, and I've explained this once, we Jews from the time of the beginning to the time of now have lived through two different spiritual eras, or periods. One is called the period of direct access, and the other is called the period of indirect access. And both of these are my own terms. Direct access means that the people were able to directly access or contact spirituality. In those days, they were able to become prophets. Nevi'im. They were able to do Nisim. They saw open Nisim. In other words, their ability to see spirituality was much open, you see. But because of the fact that they were directly accessed spirituality, the Yetzer Hara was much greater. And therefore, they had a Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah, which we no longer have. They had Yetzer Haras that we can't even begin to understand. Just like we can't understand what? The Yetzer Tov, we cannot understand the Yetzer Hara. Now, we live in the period of what's called indirect access. The way we access spirituality is not through direct context of prophecy. We do it through chokhmah, through understanding, through wisdom, through knowledge. That's a lower level at this point in time. So therefore, since our ability to understand Torah is much lessened, our ability to do Yetzer Hara is also much lessened. So we don't have a Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah. Nobody has a Yetzer Hara to what? To take a little statue in his house, a little Buddha, and begin to worship it? I mean, at least not among us. Yeah? But basically, there is no real Yetzer Hara. The truth is, I don't know if there's a Yetzer Hara there too. I travel to these countries, and I'm totally at odds to explain what Yetzer Hara they're dealing with. I mean, I was in India, and I saw a lot of these Hindu temples, and I can't understand what that Yetzer Hara was. Today, I don't understand what is a normal day Hindu or Burmese doing, worshipping Buddha, or what do you call it, or Hanuman, or whoever these the different deities. I don't understand what Yetzer Hara is that, actually. The truth is, it's not a Yetzer Hara. The Avodah Zarah which exists today is not like the Avodah Zarah before. It's a whole different thing. But that's correct. One of the things which characterize the drop in Kedusha is the fact that there's a drop in the Yetzer Hara and a drop in the Yetzer Tov. There's no question about that. I have devoted other shurim to this topic more extensively.